Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me. Let's chat for a bit about Rosshalde by Hermann Hesse, which is the most recent book that I finished. Following this chat, I'll also touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading, as well as chat a bit about what I'm planning to read next. But for now, let's spend some time on Rosshalde. This book was originally published in 1914, and I read a translation by Ralph Manheim, which, if I'm interpreting the copyright page correctly, was done in 1970. I picked up this paperback edition of Rosshalde at a used book sale a while back and have been wanting to get to it for about a year, so I'm really glad to finally have gotten it read. It's one of two Hesse novels that I would like to read in 2019, the other one being Narcissus and Goldman, which I do plan to get to, so stay tuned for that. This is the fifth of the Hesse novels that I've read, and I've chatted all of the ones that I've read previously, which I will link to below. I read Steppenwolf, I've read The Glass Bead Game twice, I've read Siddhartha and Demian, and now Rosshalde. So I am happy to continue to make my way through the Hesse novels because I really enjoy them, because I really like the way that Hesse explores a seeker, a person who becomes unhappy in their current situation and goes and tries to find a more spiritual life or a more connection to something more spiritual other than just their mundane world. And so the Hesse novels typically have had a character that does just this, and this book was no exception. What it's basically about is the very unhappy Veraguth family. Our main character is Johann Veraguth, a very successful artist, and he's married to a woman named Adele, and they live in a big manor house the name of the manor is actually called Rosshalde, so that's the title. That's where the title comes from. So yeah, they live in this big manor house, and he's a very successful artist. But he and his wife over the years have become very, very estranged, and so he is actually this manor house. He's actually moved to a small cottage that's on the grounds of the manor house that he also uses as his artist studio. So his really only connection, and only source of happiness is his little son Pierre, who's a little boy. I've forgotten the age, but quite young. And he does have an older son, Albert, who he's also very, very estranged from. But in this setting, his old friend Otto Burkhardt, who lives abroad, I think he lives in Malaysia, if I'm remembering that right, but he lives in the east somewhere, and this is in Europe, where Johann lives. I think Germany, probably, or Switzerland, or I don't know if it even says that in the book exactly, but anyway, in Europe. He's going to come back for a visit, so this is actually, when he does come, his friend Otto comes to visit him. This is actually the catalyst that sort of sets in motion a series of changes in his life, which prompts him then to go and find a more authentic life, or to begin that process. So that's basically, what the book is about. I won't give away too many of the other details of what happens. There is, it's not as easy as it might sound for Johann to break away from his family, because, like I said, he really loves his little son. He doesn't have any hatred towards his wife. I think that what has happened is that they've just grown apart and they've become strangers over time, and sort of the same thing with his older son, Albert. But he does have this very strong connection with his little son, Pierre. And so that was kind of one of the interesting themes I thought of this book was, when a loved one, holds you back from you're actually living an unhappy life, an unfulfilled life, because you can't let go of a loved one, or you're afraid to let go of or change your relationship with that loved one, afraid of losing that loved one if you were to make this change. And this is sort of the dilemma that Johann finds himself in, because his friend Otto, when he comes to visit him, knew him, in his youth, and so he recognizes immediately that his friend has become a very unhappy person, and he wants him to, to be able to transcend that, and so he invites him to come and stay with him for an extended stay in the East with him, and this is the dilemma that Johann faces in giving up his son because of the issue with the wife. I think he had at one point he and his wife had discussed this, and he was unable to let go of his little son Pierre, and the wife was also unwilling to let go of the son, so that was the struggle he was facing. But anyway, there are a series of conflicts in the book that do arise that I won't give away, that sort of pushes him along to really try to go ahead and find the courage to go and seek a more, a better life for himself. So a more authentic life for himself. So yeah, other thoughts about that. Other than how hard it is to let go of a loved one, what you need to do for your own good involves leaving people that you love behind, and the fear of losing them altogether. That idea I thought was very strong throughout this book. Also, and so sort of like how love can wind up imprisoning us, and so. Another cool part of the book was how Johann came to realize that he was a stranger in his house, or he was a stranger within the family and didn't belong in the family. He was an outsider. Oh, that didn't just happen overnight. It was slow, and he didn't even realize it at first. It took him a while to realize that things had changed to the point where he was an outsider, really, in what was supposed to be his own home. So that was really interestingly drawn throughout this novel, and I found that sort of fascinating. One other part was, his friend, like I mentioned, comes to visit him that I thought was really kind of cool, was when his friend left. At one point, Johann, the main character, is remembering back on his friend's visit, and he has been transformed in this time, or been transforming in this time. And so when he looks back on this few short weeks since his friend's been gone, and he reflects on who he was at that time, he thinks of himself really as a completely different person. And I thought that was really cool, because I think, a lot of us have had this kind of experience when we look on earlier versions of ourselves, and, we think, what were we thinking? That's sort of what he does in this relatively short amount of time. His previous self became a stranger to himself. Just as over time he became a stranger to his wife and his older son. He became a stranger to his own earlier version of himself in a way. So I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, I won't leave out. I don't want to give away any other spoilers really about how he does manage to seek this transformation and break away, but because that's sort of the meat of the novel. It's a really relatively short novels. This paperback edition is like 199 pages, so around 200 pages. So relatively short, easy to read, but a lot of stuff packed into this small story. A lot of transformation of our character Johann in a really pretty tightly drawn little story related to this very successful artist who really has it all. Externally to the outside world, he seems to have it all. Lives in a big manor house, wealthy, successful artist with art shows all over Europe, but yet a very empty and unhappy person inside, because he is not living his authentic life. So yeah, cool. So glad to have gotten Rosshalde read. Stay tuned. As I mentioned, in the future I will be getting to Narcissus and Goldman at some point this year. So all right, so what am I currently reading? I am currently reading The Happiness Hypothesis by Jonathan Haidt. I am about 30 pages away from finishing this book, so I will have this book finished today, and I'll have a chat coming up on it relatively soon, I hope. I do have, I am behind a book chat. Let me just call up the covers here. I've also finished The Day the Earth Died by Yan Lianke. This is I think it was published in Taiwan originally, and I finished this a few days ago, so I need to get a book chat up on this soon, and I will, so stay tuned for that. But my planned next read, I think, is going to be Varina by Charles Frazier. I've had this on my want-to-read list for quite some time. I actually bought this book electronically back when it came out last year, because I thought I would probably get to it last year, and I didn't. But yeah, Varina, this is a historical fiction. Charles Frazier is the author of Cold Mountain, which is one of my favorite novels of all time. But Charles Frazier does this sort of period, Civil War era period, really well. And Varina is actually, historically, was the wife of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And I'm not exactly sure what this historical fiction is about. I believe it's her experience following right at the end of the war, of the Civil War, but I'm not completely sure, but I shall find out, right? So I will hopefully, I think I'm going to get to this next because it's been on my want to read radar for so long. So I will have a book chat on that coming up fairly soon as well. I also am behind an opera chat, so I'll have an opera chat coming up soon. So stay tuned for that as well. All right, take care. Bye.